sitting down with presidential candidate David Basu Roy. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
This is your first time joining us.
Yeah, this is my first time on BPC. I'm pretty excited.
Well, I hope we make it memorable. What I want to know is the other night in the council debate, you let everybody know that on January 19th is when you really put together your campaign team. So how did you go about recruiting your volunteers and structuring your campaign team in only 2 weeks?
Great question, actually. The reason I decided so last minute was that I realized at that point that I had 20, 30, 40 people in my life who would, at the drop of a hat, do something for me. And they came together in about 2 days. We just had that kind of group. We have a lot of activities we do on a weekly basis. And, 20 or 30 of us showed up the first night, and we just got the ball rolling right away. So it was everything just fit together.
Great, great. Now, for the position of president, do you plan to approach it more as a government or as a corporation, and why?
Definitely more as a government. I mean, there is a key corporate management aspect to it. I mean, it is a corporation that handles, depending on how you want to look at it, up to $20 million a year, and that's an important role to play. But I think the biggest role that USC President plays is to really set a direction of values for the student government that the USC really is, and that its first mandate, the first responsibility of the USC President is to be the advocate for the student body. That's what they're elected for. And I'll definitely be approaching it from this perspective. I think there's 70 full-time staff almost that work for the USC that are great at setting policy, at managing policy. And I think as USC President, my job is to set the direction for any policy changes and the direction for how this policy is implemented, not to just micromanage all of the policy itself.
Great. So your campaign is focused on the USC getting back to its roots. But what I'm wondering is, since you've only been a commissioner and you haven't been a voting member on the USC, how do you know what the roots are to the USC? And that being said, how are you going to get back to those roots?
Right. Well, what I'm really getting at is just student government itself getting back to its roots, and really the entire student body getting back to its roots. I mean, students since the 50s and 60s have had a history of strong political advocacy, of being very opinionated, putting their values forth very firmly. And I think we've lost some of that. And I think it's important that the almost 30,000 full-time, part-time undergraduate students at Western really realize that there's a history of being a student where you take a big stance politically, you show your opinions, and you really have an avenue to get your initiatives and your objectives voiced throughout the campus. And that's really what I mean by getting back to our roots, is getting back to our roots of advocating for our needs and of talking about what's important to us in a very vocal and upfront and strongly marketed manner.
Now, I gotta say, I've read through a number of platforms over the past few elections. This is the first platform in recent history that I've seen that brings a platform point about governance style and a philosophical way to approach counselors. So how do you think this unique approach can hurt and help you?
In the campaign process, you mean?
In the campaign process and as your role as USC President.
Right. I'll talk about the second one first. I think in role of president, I think it will definitely help me a lot. I think, from the conversations I've had with office staff, from a lot of the people that, of those 70 staff members, they seem really interested in having a fresh face and having new perspective, and they tell me, our job is to be here to manage the policy. It's your job to control the direction this policy takes. And I think having a fresh perspective, a philosophical perspective, is very important there, and that it's going to go over very well. In terms of campaign, I'm not sure. I haven't really sensed that people want to see that kind of change. I think people talk about wanting change. They talk about apathy, voter apathy, counselor apathy. And I think the only way to get rid of that, and it's something people seem to be very vocally passionate about, and the only way to get rid of apathy is obviously through change. And I think it's, it would be hypocritical to ask for change and then not want someone to come in who's interested in really changing the scene up there. And I think that's how I'd like to approach this, and saying, here's an objective person who's been on campus but hasn't been ingrained in council. I know how things operate, but my perspective is very much from the students, not the people upstairs. And I think that's the change that's going to come, is from the student voice being up there and being very objective and just bringing student opinion back up to the top.
Great. I've also read through a lot of platforms. And I got to say that your textbook library loan service is actually, it's a great point. But what I want to know is, what research do you have to support its feasibility?
Right, definitely. That's a great question. I know a lot of people have asked me about this. I mean, what's the financial feasibility of this? From talking to U of T, they haven't quite gotten their numbers down yet, but they're not concerned about it being a big drain on them. It's not going to be financially crippling for them. It's definitely financially feasible for them. That alone means that there's obviously a chance for the bookstore to be looking into it. And from speaking to them, they already are. They haven't considered it to be, automatically profitable or automatically a loss, which means that financially there is that feasibility there. The big issue people bring up is that textbooks are released yearly, and there's a new edition. They're going to say, how are you going to loan out a textbook for a year? But the issue is that professors don't like using new textbooks. They like keeping the same textbook for 3 or 4 years. They know, like students, that the material doesn't change. So by having professors and the bookstore on board, you can have one edition of a textbook, loan it out for 3, 4, 5 years for a third of the price each time. The bookstore makes a profit, the professor has to do less work, the students save money, and in that way, it really is win-win-win for everyone on board. There's obviously a lot of logistics. They might have to consider how much profit it would cost them. But again, I think with a big enough student lobby, I think there's thousands of students that would demand the service, and I think the bookstore would listen. There's already a big issue of students copying textbooks, to be frank. We all know students can't afford $200 textbooks, and a lot of them will buy it, share it, or copy it, and that's hurting the bookstore. So if they can get people to loan textbooks, that'll bring them in direct revenue, and I think it will be better for everyone.
So what is your primary concern right now with the USC regarding the governance style and structure?
Sure. The biggest issue I have, there's two parts to it. One of it really comes down to subjectivity. The policy seems to be very politically correct, treating every student, every group of students exactly the same, which does create a sense of equality, but also makes people feel like their needs aren't well understood. And I think having come from a few different clubs, a few different faculties, some affiliate courses, I really understand how every group really has different needs, and by treating everyone the same, this especially comes up with clubs. I mean, comparing, the outdoors club that I'm on, the wine club, cultural clubs that I have close affiliations with, activities clubs, they're really all treated the same, given the same amount of space, the same amount of bookings in the atrium, and that just really doesn't work. Students all have different needs. Clubs that have 500 people for a cultural basis versus clubs that have 20 people for an activity just don't have the same needs, and while they should all have the same opportunity, I think we need to consider the nature of each club independently. The other issue is that with subjectivity is that I don't find that from the meetings I have gone to, counselors really are biased toward their constituencies, and I would expect them to be. I'd hope they were elected to represent the views of their faculties, of their councils, of their affiliates, of their faculties, wherever they come from, and I think it's important that they be very opinionated about that, and I'm a bit disappointed that people aren't standing up and saying, you know what, this is going to affect the engineers, or this is going to affect King students, and I'd really like to hear more of that and have that be encouraged. And that comes down to, for example, I'm encouraging the use of counselor t-shirts. Not mandatory, but a couple times a week, couple times a month. Wear a t-shirt so people in the faculty here know that they can come to you and say, hey, can you bring this up at the next meeting? Like, let's talk about this, give me some feedback. And I think that people like talking to people. People like making other people happy. And I think having that feedback will really get the students and the counselors more involved. And that's really what I'm trying to do, is just create accountability by building relationships between people.